The deep sound of a medieval church bell carries for miles. That single note was once the heartbeat of an entire world. We often picture the person pulling the rope as a simple servant, a background figure in a dusty tower. The truth is far more fascinating. Medieval bell ringers were keepers of profound secrets, wielders of a strange power that shaped everything from daily routines to battles against the unseen. By the end of this, you will understand the hidden science and sacred duty that made them some of the most intriguing figures of their age. What coded messages were buried in their ringing patterns, and what dark forces did they believe their bells could hold at bay? When you hear a bell today, what forgotten history do you think echoes in its sound? Their day began long before sunrise in the cold stone silence of the ringing chamber. This was the bell ringer's true domain, a room high in the tower where thick ropes descended from the darkness above like vines from a hidden forest. He was not a simple laborer. In many towns and monasteries, the bell ringer was a minor cleric, a lay brother, or a respected townsman appointed for his strength, his reliability, and his deep understanding of time itself. His life was ruled by the canonical hours, the sacred schedule that divided day and night into periods of prayer. Matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime in the early morning, and on through the day to vespers and compline. Each of these hours required a specific pattern of rings, a coded language in sound that told the devout when to pray, when to work, and when to rest. But his duty stretched far beyond the monastery walls or the parish church. The bells under his command were the town's nervous system. They called everyone to Mass on Sunday, of course, but they also signaled the opening and closing of the market gates, announced a curfew that kept the streets safe after dark, and told urgently to warn of fire or approaching danger. When a royal messenger arrived, when a child was born to the Lord, or when a respected elder passed away, it was the bell ringer who translated that event into a public announcement heard by every soul within earshot. This required immense precision and a mind for patterns. The ringing chamber was a place of practical mathematics, where the ringer had to calculate the swing of massive bells weighing hundreds of pounds, coordinating multiple ropes to create the rising and falling peals that carried for miles. It was a craft blending physical endurance, spiritual duty, and hidden knowledge, all contained within those stone walls. And it is within that chamber that the deeper mysteries of his role begin to unfold far beyond the marking of time. This knowledge of patterns was a secret code, a language spoken in bronze that every villager understood. The bells did not just mark time, they told stories. The most common and somber of these stories was told through the toll. A single bell struck at slow, measured intervals meant a death in the community. But the code went deeper. Often, the number of tolls that followed that initial announcement held specific meaning. In many parishes, 9 tolls for a man, 6 for a woman, and 3 for a child created an audible portrait of the departed, allowing a farmer in a distant field or a weaver at her loom to know, without a single spoken word, who had passed from their world. The rhythm itself was a public elegy. Contrast this with the sound of a celebration. A wedding, a feast day, or a royal birth was announced with a peal. This was not a single bell, but a cascading, overlapping riot of sound from multiple bells rung in quick succession. It was controlled chaos, a sonic representation of joy that could lift the heart and fill the entire town with a sense of shared occasion. But the bell ringer's most critical duty lay in the language of urgency. There were specific, practiced patterns for danger. A rapid, incessant ringing of a single bell, often with a frantic, uneven rhythm, was the universal signal for fire. It would send townspeople grabbing buckets and forming chains to the well. Another distinct sequence, perhaps a deep, booming alarm from the largest bell, could warn of an approaching army or raiders, sending people rushing to the gates or seeking shelter within the church walls. In an age without sirens or telephones, the bell ringer was the town's nervous system, translating crisis into a code of sound that triggered immediate, life-saving action. His memory had to hold these patterns perfectly, for a mistake in the joyful peal was an embarrassment, but a mistake in the alarm could mean disaster. This coded language made him not just a timekeeper, but the community's most vital broadcaster, speaking a fluent tongue of bronze that conveyed everything from deepest grief to most desperate warning. Yet the most astonishing secret of the ringing chamber was not the code of messages, but the code of mathematics. For the most skilled ringers, particularly in the great towers of England from the late medieval period onward, the craft evolved into a breathtaking intellectual discipline known as change ringing. This was not merely pulling ropes in rhythm, it was the performance of a living, breathing algorithm cast in bronze. The goal was simple in concept but dizzying in execution: to ring a set of bells, say 5 or 6, in every possible order without ever repeating a sequence. Each of these precise orders is called a change, and the entire non-repeating series is a peal. To achieve this, ringers followed strict, memorized rules that governed how each bell moved one position at a time in the sequence, weaving an intricate mathematical dance. They gave these patterns names like Plain Bob or Grandsire, which were essentially the blueprints for the entire performance. A single peal on 6 bells requires 720 unique changes. Memorizing this was a monumental feat of mental discipline, a form of combinatorial mathematics practiced not on parchment, but in the air. The ringer had to know not only his own bell's path through the pattern, but also listen acutely to the bells around him, his every move dictated by the collective sound. It was a team endeavor of perfect trust and coordination, where one missed cue would collapse the entire mathematical structure into chaos. High above the oblivious town, these men were engaged in a secret science, manipulating permutations and sequences with a sophistication that would not be formally studied for centuries. Their tower was a calculator, their ropes the inputs, and the soaring, ever-changing music that resulted was the output of a hidden, intellectual art. This transforms our image completely. The bell ringer was not just a town crier with a rope. He was a practitioner of an abstract and beautiful logic, his mind holding architectures of sound that few below could even comprehend. And if the bells held such power over pattern and order, what did people believe they could do against the formless chaos of the dark? This intellectual mastery, however, came at a brutal physical price. To dance with mathematics in the air, a ringer first had to wrestle with sheer, terrifying weight. The largest bells in a cathedral tower could weigh several tons, their bronze forms casting shadows as massive as wagons. When such a bell was set in motion, it gathered a momentum that was almost alive, a force that could not be simply stopped. The ringer's connection to this force was a thick hemp rope attached to a massive wheel high above. His job was to guide that momentum, not fight it. He would pull the rope in a precise, rhythmic arc, using his body weight to add to the swing, then ride the rope back up as the bell reached its peak, his feet often leaving the floor in a controlled leap. This delicate balance was everything. A mistimed pull or a slip of the hands could have catastrophic results. The most common danger was being hoisted violently into the air, dragged up toward the ceiling by the unchecked rope, resulting in broken bones or worse when gravity took over. Rope burns that stripped skin from palms were a routine hazard, and veteran ringers' hands were maps of tough, woven scars. The ultimate fear, whispered in every tower, was that of the bell itself breaking free. If a mounting failed or a rope snapped, the multi-ton mass could swing wildly, crashing through the wooden frame and stonework, potentially collapsing the entire chamber. Beyond these acute dangers were the grinding demands of endurance. A festive peal celebrating a royal visit could last for hours, requiring constant, focused exertion. All-night vigils for important holy days meant ringing patterns in the bitter cold of the tower, hour after hour, with only the stars visible through the louvered openings for company. This relentless physical hardship forged a unique brotherhood. bell ringers were a tough, resilient breed, bound by shared calluses and the unspoken understanding of the power they commanded and the risks they faced every time they took a rope in hand. Their strength was not just in their arms, but in their unwavering focus, a necessity when one moment of lost concentration could mean a fall from the heights. And it was this very focus, this intimate dance with danger, that connected them to beliefs far older than the church itself, to a time when the sound of a bell was thought to do more than mark the hours. That intimate dance with danger was confined to a world of stone and sound, a world the bell ringer rarely left. For many, their home was the tower itself. A small, Spartan chamber, often just below the ringing room, served as their cell. It was a space defined by necessity, a simple cot, a stool, a small hearth for warmth, and a narrow window offering a panoramic, lonely view of the world they served. In larger parishes, a dedicated cottage might stand in the churchyard, but even then, the tower's shadow was always upon it. Their diet reflected their station, simple and sustaining. A daily loaf of coarse bread, a pot of pottage made from peas and barley, perhaps a bit of salted fish or a wedge of hard cheese. This was often supplemented by what the community provided, a form of payment in kind. A baker might offer a finer loaf after a well-rung Sunday service. A farmer might leave a sack of turnips at the tower door in gratitude for the reliable curfew bell. Their sustenance was woven into the social fabric they maintained with their ropes. Life in the tower was a study in profound solitude, punctuated by moments of immense public responsibility. The stone walls, thick enough to muffle the outside world, created a unique acoustic prison. When the bells were silent, the quiet was absolute, a heavy stillness broken only by the wind whistling through the louvers or the scuttling of mice in the walls. But when the bells rang, especially the great tenor bell directly above, the sound was not just heard, it was felt. The entire tower would thrum, the vibration traveling through the stone floor and up through the soles of the feet. After a long peal, a ringer's ears would ring with a phantom echo for hours, a constant reminder of his duty. This duality, the crushing quiet and the overwhelming noise, shaped a unique psychology. The bells were both his purpose and his constant companions, their voices marking every hour of his lonely vigil. In that isolated state, with the wind moaning through the tower and the shadows growing long, it was only natural for the mind to wander beyond the physical. The line between the comforting sound of the Angelus bell and a more primal fear of what might lurk in the silent dark began to blur. What if the bells were not just calling the faithful to prayer, but were also keeping something else at bay? That profound solitude in the tower nurtured a deeper, more ancient belief. Beyond marking time and sending messages, the bells were considered spiritual weapons, and the ringer who wielded them was a warrior against invisible forces. This belief was rooted in a sacred ceremony, the baptism of the bell itself. Before a new bell was hung, a bishop would perform a ritual nearly identical to the baptism of a child, anointing it with holy oils, giving it a saint's name, and officially welcoming it into the service of God. This transformed the bronze from mere metal into a consecrated object, a vessel of divine power. Its voice was therefore considered holy, capable of purifying the very air. People believed the sound waves physically scattered malevolent spirits and demons who were thought to flee from the sacred resonance. This made the routine ringing of the bells, especially at dusk, an act of community defense, casting a protective sonic barrier over the sleeping town. This power was called upon most dramatically during violent thunderstorms. In an age that saw storms as the work of demons or the wrath of God, villagers would engage in a practice known as ringing the devil's knell. At the first crack of thunder, the bell ringer would be summoned to his ropes. He would then ring the largest bell in a frantic, sustained clamor, not to warn of the weather but to fight it. The belief was that the holy sound would shatter the demonic forces driving the storm, breaking the clouds and calming the winds. It was a direct, audible battle between the sacred and the profane, with the ringer on the front lines. His role as a spiritual guardian was most formalized within the church service itself through the Sanctus bell. This was a small handbell or a set of bells rung at the most sacred moment of the Mass, the consecration, when the bread and wine were believed to become the body and blood of Christ. At that precise instant, the bell ringer, often a server near the altar, would ring the bell 3 times. This served a dual purpose. It was a signal to the congregation, many of whom might be distracted or at the back of a large cathedral, that a miracle was occurring, calling them to bow their heads in reverence. But more mystically, the sound was believed to sanctify the moment further, its holy resonance marking and protecting the divine presence now on the altar. In every one of these acts, from dispersing storms to highlighting a miracle, the bell ringer operated on a frontier unseen by others. He was not just a timekeeper or a mathematician. He was a guardian who used the baptized voice of bronze to maintain a circle of safety, holding back the chaos of the dark with every measured, purposeful ring. This sacred duty of protection faced its ultimate test in the middle of the 14th century. The soundscape of Europe was utterly transformed, not by celebration or alarm, but by a single, relentless note. The Black Death did not just fill the streets with silence and the air with smoke from mass graves. It filled the sky with a constant, mournful dirge of bronze. The bell ringer's role became one of unending, grim ritual. His days were no longer marked by the varied patterns for market, prayer, or curfew, but by the slow, measured toll for the dead. One toll, then a pause, then another, a sound as regular and terrible as a heartbeat fading from the world. He would ring for the carpenter's wife in the morning, for the miller's children in the afternoon, and for the parish priest himself by nightfall. The code of the toll, once a precise signal, was often overwhelmed by sheer numbers, collapsing into a generalized, continuous knell of community grief. The bells became the voice of the plague itself, a sonic shadow hanging over every town and village. The bell ringer himself stood in a uniquely vulnerable position. While many fled or barricaded themselves indoors, his duty forced him into constant, dangerous contact. He lived in the heart of the community, often receiving his meager supplies directly from townsfolk who might be carrying the sickness. He would hear the news of each death firsthand from grieving family members or the desperate sexton. Every time he descended from his tower to learn the name for the next toll, he risked breathing the same infected air. There was no escape from his post, for the bells had to ring. In this, he became more than a witness. He was a participant in the collective mourning, his own hands producing the sound that defined an era of terror. And then, one day, in the worst afflicted places, the tolling would simply stop. The most chilling possibility of all is that the ringer, like so many others, finally succumbed. With no one left who knew the ropes or had the strength to pull them, the great bell would fall silent. In a world where that sound was the anchor of time, the marker of life's passages, and a shield against the unseen, its absence would have been a profound spiritual catastrophe. The silence in the tower would have been more terrifying than any storm. It meant the final victory of the chaos they had long fought to keep at bay, a void where the community's heartbeat used to be. This somber reality adds a layer of immense gravity to the bell ringer's role. He was the one who sounded the lament for a dying world, sometimes right up until his own last breath. His enduring legacy, however, was not forged in this despair, but in the quiet, stubborn continuity of his craft long after the plague carts were gone. The silence after the plague was a wound, but life and its dangers always returned. With that return came the bell ringer's most urgent and secular duty, his role as the town's first and last line of defense. High in his stone perch, he often served as a watchman, his eyes scanning the horizon where the road met the distant woods. He was looking for the glint of sunlight on spear tips, the unnatural dust cloud of marching men, or the telltale smoke of raiders' fires. His vantage point made him a vital node in a crude but effective intelligence network. When he saw danger, his response was not a shout but a transformation of sound. The calm, measured patterns for prayer or time were shattered by a new rhythm, a frantic, sustained assault on the largest bell. This was the alarm peal, a sound designed to bypass thought and trigger pure instinct. It was not a melody, but a sonic panic, a continuous, booming clamor that vibrated in the chest of every listener. That sound was an immediate command. Farmers in the fields would drop their tools and run for the walls. Mothers would gather children and hurry toward the church or the Lord's keep. The town's militia, often just blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants, would grab their assigned weapons from the guild hall and rush to predetermined defensive positions at the gates or on the ramparts. The bell ringer did not just warn of a threat, he activated the entire community's defense protocol with his ropes. But his role did not end with the first alarm. Once the initial chaos settled into organized defense, the ringing took on a new purpose. If the town was besieged, the constant sound of the bell served as a beacon and a morale tool. For friendly forces who might be in the area, the sustained ringing was a clear signal of distress, a sound that could cut through the darkness or fog to guide them to the fight. Within the walls, that relentless peal was a drum of defiance, a public promise that the watch was still being kept, that the community's heart was still beating strongly against the threat outside. In this capacity, the bell ringer was no longer just a spiritual guardian or a timekeeper. He was a soldier in a tower. His hands on the rope directly controlled the mobilization of an army and the flight of civilians. A moment's hesitation or a failure of nerve could mean the difference between a town saved and a town overrun. The weight he managed was no longer just the physical tonnage of bronze, but the literal safety of every soul within the sound of his bell. This immense responsibility forged a different kind of respect, one built on trust in his vigilance and courage. And yet, for all this power over life and death in the material world, the bell ringer's most enduring legacy may have been woven from something far more delicate, the simple human need for connection in an age of isolation. This immense responsibility was rarely shouldered alone. The bell ringer belonged to a hidden world within the world, a fraternity bound by ropes and rhythm. Across Europe, but most famously in England, these men formed secretive guilds and brotherhoods dedicated solely to the art and science of ringing. These were not casual clubs, they were formal societies with strict rules, initiation rites, and solemn oaths of secrecy. To become a member was to enter an inner circle, a privileged group that guarded its knowledge as closely as any medieval craft guild protected its trade secrets. The process began with a long and demanding apprenticeship. A young man, often the son or nephew of a ringer, would start as a mere observer in the tower, watching the complex dance of ropes and listening to the patterns. His first hands-on task was usually with the smallest, lightest bell, learning the basic feel of the swing under the watchful eye of the master. For years, he would practice the foundational changes, the building blocks of the peal, until his movements became instinct. Only when the master ringers were satisfied with his skill, his strength, and crucially, his reliability would he be considered for initiation. The ceremony itself was shrouded in mystery, often conducted in the ringing chamber after dark. The candidate might be blindfolded, asked to repeat archaic oaths promising to uphold the standards of the guild, to keep its methods secret from outsiders, and to always aid a fellow ringer in need. He might be given a symbolic token, like a specially knotted piece of bell rope, to mark his new status. This ritual transformed him from a student into a brother of the sound. The primary purpose of these guilds was to ensure quality and preserve a sacred tradition. They established the rigorous standards for what constituted a true mathematical peal, and they fiercely policed those standards. A sloppy performance or a botched sequence at a major event would bring shame not just on the individual, but on the entire local brotherhood. They were the custodians of the complex methods with names like Kent Treble Bob and Stedman, intricate blueprints for sound that were memorized, not written down, passed verbally from one generation to the next. This oral tradition was a powerful tool of secrecy. The average townsfolk heard beautiful, cascading music, but they had no access to the mental architecture that produced it. The knowledge lived within the circle, making the ringers seem like mystics who communed directly with the bells. Beyond preserving technique, the guilds provided a vital support network. They collected dues to care for members who fell ill or were injured by a rogue rope. They settled disputes within the tower and represented the ringers' interests to church authorities or town councils. This created a powerful sense of solidarity. A traveling ringer could find food, shelter, and camaraderie with the local brotherhood in a distant town, simply by demonstrating his knowledge of the craft. This closed world of oaths, rituals, and shared secrets ultimately cemented the bell ringers' mysterious reputation. To the public, they were a united front, speaking a private language and performing miracles of coordination high above the church nave. They were the keepers of a living algorithm, a brotherhood of the bell whose true knowledge remained, quite literally, out of reach. Within that secretive brotherhood, the tools were extensions of the ringer's own body and mind. The most immediate connection was, of course, the rope, but not all rope was the same. Each bell had two distinct sections. The lower part was the smooth, plain tail, gripped for control. Above it was the sally, a thick, woolen section woven with colorful worsted yarn in a distinctive spiral pattern. This was not mere decoration. The sally's soft, fuzzy texture and bright colors provided a critical visual and tactile marker in the dim light of the ringing chamber. As multiple ropes flew up and down in complex arcs, a ringer could spot his own sally in the blur, its unique colors telling him exactly where his bell was in its swing. Gripping the sally was the signal to pull, its wool providing a firm, non-slip hold even with sweating palms. High above, out of sight in the gloom of the bell chamber, was the machine that transformed a human pull into the majestic swing of bronze. This was the wheel, a massive wooden circle, often 6 feet or more in diameter, mounted to the bell's headstock. The rope was tied to its rim. When the ringer pulled, he was not pulling the bell directly. He was turning this great wheel, which used mechanical advantage to set the ton of metal above him into a controlled, accelerating arc. The system was completed by metal fittings of forged iron, the staples and gudgeons that held the bell frame together, and the stay, a wooden beam that caught the bell at its balance point, allowing it to be set mouth upward for maintenance or for the delicate starting positions of appeal. These were the physical instruments worn smooth by generations of hands, yet the most prized tools were not made of hemp or oak but of vellum and ink. For the most advanced ringers, the complex mathematical patterns of change ringing were too intricate to hold solely in memory. They were recorded in rare, handwritten manuscripts. These were not published books but personal notebooks, meticulously copied and passed from master to apprentice. Within their pages, in a dense, cryptic shorthand, were the diagrams and notations for the methods, the precise blueprints for performances like Grandsire Triples or Cambridge Surprise. To an outsider, these pages were incomprehensible, a forest of dots, lines, and strange symbols, but to a trained ringer they were a sacred map. A single manuscript might contain decades of accumulated knowledge, the carefully worked out solutions to musical mathematical problems. Possessing one was a mark of immense status. It transformed the owner from a skilled laborer into a literate technician, a keeper of arcane algorithms. These notebooks were guarded with the same fervor as a master baker's secret recipe or an alchemist's formula. They were the intellectual property of the guild, physical proof that the soaring music heard from the tower was not born of chaos, but from a deeply studied and secretly recorded science. The calloused hands that pulled the ropes were often the same hands that could decipher this elegant code, bridging the gap between sheer physical force and the most abstract patterns of the mind. The path to joining that secretive brotherhood began not with a bell but with a broom. A young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, would be brought to the ringing chamber by his father, an uncle, or a family friend who was already a member of the guild. His first view of that lofty room was not of glory but of dust and drudgery. For months, even years, he was simply the tower boy. His duties were utterly mundane, sweeping the stone floor of pigeon droppings and old rope fibers, polishing the brass fittings until they gleamed, and most importantly, caring for the ropes themselves. He learned to splice frayed ends with intricate knots that had to hold under immense strain, and to rub the hemp with beeswax to keep it supple and strong. This was not busy work. It was a deliberate test of patience, humility, and meticulous attention to detail. A poorly maintained rope could snap, a dirty chamber showed disrespect for the craft. The master ringers watched him closely, not for brilliance but for reliability. Could he be trusted to show up in the cold dark before dawn? Would he take pride in a perfectly coiled rope? His apprenticeship in the secret art began with the profound lesson that everything, even the grandest peal, depended on the integrity of the smallest, most overlooked element. Only after proving his steadiness would he be allowed to step closer to the sound. His next role was that of a silent observer. He would stand in a designated corner of the ringing chamber, absolutely still during practices and Sunday services. His task was to watch, to listen, and to absorb. He studied the dance of the sallies, how each colored rope traced a specific arc in the air. He began to distinguish the individual voices of the bells, the bright treble, the mellow middle bells, the profound, earth-shaking boom of the tenor. Most crucially, he started to hear the patterns. At first, the ringing was just a beautiful noise, but slowly, through relentless exposure, his ear began to pick out the sequences. He learned to anticipate when his uncle's bell would sound next in a simple round. This development of the musical ear was non-negotiable. A ringer who could not listen was useless, a danger to himself and others. He had to learn to feel the rhythm in his bones, to understand timing not as numbers on a page, but as a physical sensation woven into the sound vibrating through the tower stone. This period of silent absorption could last another year or more, a long audition for the privilege of touch. The day he was finally handed a rope was a moment of solemn initiation. It was never for a large bell. He would start with the lightest bell in the set, the treble, whose rope required the least strength but the greatest precision. His first lesson was not about making music but about controlling momentum. A senior ringer would stand behind him, hands over his, guiding him through the basic motion, the pull, the follow, the gentle check. He learned the terrifying and exhilarating feel of the bell's weight coming alive at the end of the rope, a living force he now had to coax and command. For months he practiced nothing but this, ringing the single treble bell to a steady, monotonous beat, building the muscle memory and the nerve. Mistakes were met not with shouts but with grave corrections. Letting the rope overrun could see him dragged up toward the ceiling, a harsh but effective teacher. As his confidence grew, he was introduced to simple changes, swapping places with the bell next to him in the sequence. This was where the oral tradition became his lifeline. There were no books for him yet. The methods were spoken, sung almost in a cryptic chant of numbers and positions. Treble leads, 2 follows, 3 stays behind. He would repeat these phrases under his breath, tying the verbal pattern to the physical action, until the connection between word, movement, and sound became seamless. The final, formidable summit of his training was the tenor bell. This was the largest, deepest voiced bell, the foundation of every peal. Its rope was the heaviest, its swing the most powerful and deliberate. Mastering it required a different kind of strength, less about speed and more about immense, steady control. Ringing the tenor was an act of authority. It set the pace for the entire team. A hurried tenor would rush the whole peal into chaos, a slow one would drag it down. When he was finally deemed ready to take the tenor rope during a practice, it signaled his transition from apprentice to a true ringer in the making. It was then, and only then, that the deeper secrets were gradually entrusted to him. The master would begin to impart the complex mathematical sequences for the grandest peals, the confidential emergency signals known only to the guild, and the precise ritual timings for holy days that differed from parish to parish. This knowledge was parceled out slowly, each piece earned through demonstrated skill and unwavering discretion. The apprenticeship was in every sense a rite of passage. It bound him not just to a skill, but to a lineage. He became a link in a chain of secret keepers that stretched back generations, his hands now responsible for maintaining a living tradition of sound, science, and silence. The relentless accuracy of his ringing governed every aspect of daily life. In a world without pocket watches or town hall clocks, the bell ringer was the human mechanism at the center of the community's schedule. His timepiece was not made of gears but of ancient prayer. The canonical hours established by monastic rules centuries earlier provided the unshakable framework. His day began in the profound darkness with matins, a call to prayer in the dead of night that also served as a signal for travelers, midwives, and sleepless souls. As the first hint of grey touched the horizon, he would ring for lauds, officially ending the night and beginning the day's labor. This was the true wake-up call for an entire town. With that sound, bakers would stoke their ovens, farmers would harness their oxen, and maids would begin drawing water from the well. The bells continued to carve the daylight into purposeful blocks. Prime marked the start of the formal workday, a signal for craftsmen to open their shops and for laborers to report to their tasks. Terce, rung mid-morning, was a sanctioned break, a moment for a sip of ale and a bite of bread. Sext coincided with the sun's zenith, calling a pause for the midday meal and a brief rest during the day's hottest hours. This precise rhythm was not just spiritual, it was profoundly practical. The opening of the market gates was tied to prime, ensuring no merchant gained an unfair advantage by starting early. Court sessions began after terce, so all parties had time to assemble. The orderly progression of civic life depended entirely on the reliability of the man in the tower. His task, however, was far from simple. The tools available to measure these intervals were notoriously unreliable. A sundial was useless on a cloudy day or during the long nights of winter. A water clock or clepsydra could freeze in cold weather or flow unevenly as its reservoir emptied. Often, the bell ringer's most vital skill was his own cultivated sense of time, a feeling in his bones honed by years of ritual. He would watch the sun's arc, note the length of shadows on the churchyard, and listen for the natural cues of the world around him. The crowing of a rooster, the changing light, the behavior of animals. His judgment call was final. When he decided it was time for sext, it was time for sext, regardless of what a faulty water clock might say. This granted him a subtle but immense power. By ringing even a few minutes early, he could shorten a laborer's morning shift. By holding back, he could extend a merchant's trading time. While outright abuse would undermine his essential role, the potential for influence was always there, woven into the very sound of the bells. His final rings of the day solidified this control. Vespers at dusk signaled the end of work, a time to return home, share the evening meal, and reflect. Compline was the last call of the night, a sound that coincided with the closing of the town gates and the enforcement of curfew. Once that deep tone faded into the darkness, respectable people were expected to be off the streets. The watchmen now patrolled, and anyone abroad without good reason could be detained. In this way, the bell ringer did not just announce the time, he actively enforced the boundary between order and disorder, between the productive day and the protected night. His voice in bronze was the law. He was the town's clock, its schedule keeper, and a quiet enforcer of social harmony, all through the measured, unwavering discipline of his ropes. This daily authority, however, placed him in a unique social position, somewhere between a respected official and a solitary outsider. That absolute authority over the daily rhythm made its absence all the more terrifying. In a world ordered by sound, the deliberate silence of the bells was not an empty space, it was a message filled with dread. The most profound and expected of these silences came during Holy Week, the days leading up to Easter. From the Gloria of Mass on Maundy Thursday until the Easter Vigil, the bells of every church in Christendom fell utterly silent. Their voices were replaced by the stark, wooden clatter of the crotales, a simple noisemaker that sounded like giant, hollow bones knocking together. This substitution was a sonic embodiment of mourning, a communal act of humility that stripped away the glorious bronze voice to mark the death of Christ. For a population whose lives were measured in peals and tolls, this annual silence was deeply unsettling, a shared disorientation that made the world feel spiritually adrift until the triumphant ringing at Easter dawn broke the spell and restored order. But not all silences were sacred rituals. A far more frightening silence was imposed as punishment, known as an interdict. This was an ecclesiastical weapon of last resort. If a ruler defied the church, perhaps by seizing its lands or imprisoning a bishop, the Pope could place the entire region under an interdict. The order would go out to every bell ringer in the affected lands. The bells were to be stilled, no calls to Mass, no joyful peals for weddings, not even the toll for the dead. The churches would remain locked, the sacraments withheld. This was a spiritual siege, cutting an entire community off from the sounds of grace and the rituals of salvation. The psychological impact was devastating. The familiar voice of divine order was suddenly, shockingly absent, replaced by a void that felt like abandonment. The bell ringer, once the herald of God's time, became the enforcer of this terrible silence. His idle ropes a daily reminder of their ruler's transgression and the community's collective punishment. The pressure to lift the interdict always grew unbearable, not from political argument, but from the profound, soundless anxiety of the people. Beyond these imposed silences, an unexpected quiet from the tower was an immediate signal of catastrophe. If the dawn bell did not sound, villagers would peer anxiously toward the church. If the curfew bell remained silent as darkness fell, fear would spread through the streets. Such an unplanned silence could mean only one of a few terrible things. It could signal that the plague had finally taken the ringer himself, leaving no one to pull the ropes. It could mean an invading army was so close that ringing would give away the town's position, so the watchful ringer maintained a breathless quiet. Or, in the worst case, it could mean the town had already fallen, its conquerors silencing the bells as a symbol of their total control. In this way, the absence of expected sound was a more urgent alarm than any peal, triggering instant dread and preparation for the worst. This gave rise to powerful superstitions. A bell that cracked and fell silent, or a tower struck by lightning that could no longer ring, was seen as a dire omen. It was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure with the community, a withdrawal of heavenly protection. People whispered that the holy voice had been broken because the town had grown sinful or corrupt. In the folklore of many regions, silent bells were also a victory for the dark forces the bells normally kept at bay. It was said that demons and malevolent spirits, usually scattered by the sacred sound, would gather and grow bold in a territory where the bells no longer rang. The bell ringer, therefore, guarded not just the sound but the silence. His decision to ring or not to ring carried immense weight. He controlled the community's access to the divine schedule. He enforced its spiritual punishments, and his failure to act signaled existential threats. The inverse power of withheld sound was, in its own way, as potent as the most glorious peal. It proved that the true instrument was not merely the bell, but the sacred rhythm of life itself, a rhythm that, when broken, revealed just how fragile that medieval world truly was. The immense power they wielded and the silence they guarded inevitably wove them into the fabric of local legend. In the medieval imagination, the bell ringer occupied a liminal space, a man who trafficked with holy sounds yet worked in the lonely, shadowy heights, and this ambiguity bred a rich folklore of curses and ghosts. One persistent tale told of a ringer struck dead at his rope for committing a grave sacrilege. In one version, a proud and irreverent ringer decides to ring a joyous peal on Good Friday, the one day of absolute bell silence commemorating the crucifixion. As he pulls the rope, a bolt of lightning is said to cleave the tower, silencing him forever as divine punishment for his arrogance. Another story warns of the consequences of a mistake during the Sanctus Bell at the moment of consecration. A ringer distracted by worldly thoughts, perhaps gazing out the tower window at a pretty maiden in the street, misses his cue and rings a fraction of a second late. That night he is found lifeless in the ringing chamber, the rope still in his hand, his error having fractured the sacred moment and invoked a fatal curse. These stories served as powerful moral lessons, reinforcing the absolute precision and reverence required for the role. A single mistimed pull was not just an error, it was a spiritual transgression with potentially cosmic consequences. But the legends extended beyond the ringer's death to his eternal rest, or lack thereof. Across Europe, variations of the phantom ringer ghost story are told. In a coastal village, the sound of the great tenor bell tolling by itself on a still, foggy night was a sure omen of a shipwreck to come at dawn. The spirit of a long-dead ringer was performing his final duty, warning of disaster from beyond the grave. In a town plagued by misfortune, locals might whisper that the ghost of a ringer who died in a tragic fall during a storm was still bound to his tower. On the anniversary of his death or during violent weather, people claimed to hear the faint, rhythmic creak of a rope being pulled and the muffled, ghostly echo of a bell that never actually moved. These tales reflect a deep-seated belief that the role was so powerful, so intrinsically tied to the fate of a place, that not even death could fully sever the connection. The bell ringer became a permanent part of the landscape's soul, his duty eternal. This folklore blurred the line completely. He was no longer just a sacred custodian or a town functionary. He was a figure permanently touched by the supernatural, his very essence merged with the stones of his tower and the sound he produced. The awe and fear he inspired in life simply transformed, in the stories people told, into an eternal vigilance or a mournful warning from the other side. And if the bell ringer's spirit could linger, what became of the physical tools he left behind, the objects infused with a lifetime of sacred labor? The legends of phantom ringers speak to a role so powerful it defied death, yet history has often overlooked a quieter presence in the belfry. While the image of the solitary man in the tower is dominant, the sacred sound of bells was not exclusively a male domain. Within the cloistered walls of convents across Europe, nuns were the undisputed mistresses of their own bells. Their daily life, like that of monks, was structured by the canonical hours, and the call to prayer was sounded by sisters chosen for this solemn duty. In a nunnery, the bell ringer was not a distant figure in a high tower, but a member of the community, her rope descending into the cloister or chapel. Her ringing marked their shared devotions, their meals, and their periods of silent work. This was an essential, sacred office, a vital part of the convent's heartbeat, performed with the same discipline and reverence as any task given to a brother in a monastery. The art and science of change ringing, however, with its demanding physicality and its secretive guilds, remained largely closed to them in the public sphere. Yet even there, at the edges of parish life, whispers of female ringers persist in local lore, suggesting their presence, however rare, was not entirely absent. These whispers often emerge in folklore, where women take up the rope in moments of ultimate crisis. One common tale, found in variations from the Scottish Highlands to the villages of France, tells of a lone woman who becomes the town's savior. The story goes that all the men are away at war or have fallen to plague when a great danger approaches, a wildfire, a flood, or an invading war band. With no one else to sound the alarm, a woman, perhaps the bell ringer's daughter or a widow familiar with the tower, climbs the winding stairs. She seizes the heavy rope of the great tenor bell and rings it with all her strength, not with a complex peal, but with a frantic, sustained clamor that rallies the remaining women, children, and elderly to defend or flee. In these stories, she is not a trained member of the guild, but an ordinary person performing an extraordinary act, her courage breaking the strict gender norms of the day to fulfill the bell's most fundamental purpose: protection. Other legends tie women to the bells in contexts of profound mourning or supernatural communication. There are tales of mothers who, upon learning their sons were lost at sea, would ascend the tower at night to toll the passing bell themselves, their personal grief given a public voice in bronze. Some ghost stories feature the spectral Grey Lady of a parish, a mournful spirit said to toll the bell before a tragedy in the founding family's line, her eternal sorrow linked to the sound that once marked her own death. These narratives, while fictional, reveal a deep cultural understanding that the emotional and spiritual weight of the bell, its roles in lament and warning, could resonate with feminine experience. They hint that while the public professional title of bell ringer was almost always held by men, the relationship with the bells themselves was more fluid, touching the lives of women in moments of extremity, devotion, and story. The historical record offers fleeting, concrete glimpses that align with these whispers. Churchwardens' accounts from some English parishes occasionally note small payments to women for helping with the bells on major feast days, likely assisting with the strenuous work of ringing the largest bells during long celebrations. In a few rare instances, widows of master ringers are recorded as maintaining the right to the ringing house or receiving a stipend, suggesting a familial connection to the craft that was formally acknowledged. These were not guild members, but they existed in the orbit of the bell tower, their hands sometimes touching the ropes that governed their world. Searching for these overlooked voices complicates the narrative in a vital way. It reminds us that the history of this secret life is not monolithic. The art transcended gender in the cloister, and the duty broke gender barriers in folklore and fleeting moments of necessity. The sound that ordered medieval life may have been produced almost exclusively by male hands, but it was heard, interpreted, and in certain hidden corners, answered by women, adding a richer, more nuanced layer to the echo we try to hear from the past. The ropes in his hands were only one part of a vast, immobile instrument. Every bell ringer performed within a structure meticulously engineered for a single purpose: to cast sound across the landscape. The medieval bell tower was not merely a tall stone pillar, it was a finely tuned speaker cabinet built on a monumental scale. Architects designed these towers with acoustics as a primary concern, shaping stone and space to transform a metallic clang into a clear, far-reaching voice. The journey of that sound began in the bell chamber itself. This high room was often designed with specific proportions, its walls sometimes slightly angled or its ceiling vaulted to prevent sound waves from cancelling each other out in a muddy echo. The goal was resonance, to let the bronze voice bloom and gather strength before it was released into the world. The most critical architectural features were the louvered openings, the slatted windows we often see at the top of towers. These were not just for ventilation or to let in light, they were the baffles of a giant loudspeaker. Their angled wooden slats were carefully positioned to deflect rain and wind while directing the sound waves outward in a focused horizontal plane. Instead of letting the noise dissipate uselessly upward, the louvers pushed it over the rooftops, across fields, and down into the streets below, ensuring the message carried to the farthest ear. The materials chosen were essential to this function. The thick stone walls did more than support weight, they acted as a massive sounding board. When the great tenor bell swung, it set the entire tower humming, the vibration through the masonry adding a profound, physical depth to the sound that traveled through the very earth. The choice of wood for the massive bell frame and the wheel was also deliberate, selected for qualities that would complement rather than dampen the metallic ring. This was architecture in service of frequency and wavelength, a science of amplification understood through experience and tradition. For the ringer working within this stone instrument, the environment shaped his craft. He felt the tower's resonance in his feet. He learned how the sound changed with the weather, how a damp, foggy morning would muffle the peal while a crisp, still evening would let it soar for extraordinary distances. His tower was his partner, and his skill lay in working with its acoustic personality. When he pulled the rope, he was not just ringing a bell, he was activating an entire architectural system designed to make his town heard for miles. This deep connection between craftsman and structure reveals a profound truth. The medieval soundscape was not an accident. It was built. That profound sound, however, was not universally adored. The bell ringer's art stood at the heart of a fierce medieval debate, a conflict over whether his work was sacred music or mere disruptive noise. On one side stood the poets and the mystics who heard something celestial in the complex peals. They described the harmonious ringing of a well-tuned ring as the music of the spheres made earthly, a mathematical echo of the divine order that governed the cosmos. To them, the ascending and descending tones were a form of prayer more potent than words, a sonic ladder connecting heaven and earth. The bell ringer, in this view, was a musician playing the grandest instrument of all, translating cosmic harmony into a form the entire community could hear and feel. Yet in the quiet cloisters of monasteries, a very different opinion often festered. Stricter monastic reformers who prized silence as the highest form of devotion saw excessive or overly elaborate bell ringing as a vanity. They complained bitterly in their writings about the clangor that shattered their contemplation, calling it a pointless noise that served human pride more than divine glory. To them, the booming peals for a nobleman's wedding or a town festival were not spiritual but worldly, a disruptive clamor that pulled the mind away from God and toward earthly celebration. This was not a minor disagreement. It placed the bell ringer directly in a cultural conflict about the very purpose of sound in society. Was his primary duty to create beauty that lifted souls toward the divine? Or was it simply to transmit practical information as efficiently as possible? Was the intricate, joyful peal a legitimate offering to God, or was it an empty show of technical skill that disturbed the peace of more devout souls? The ringer himself had to navigate these competing expectations daily. He answered to a parish priest who might demand glorious music for a feast day, while a nearby abbey might send a formal complaint about the very same performance. His work, therefore, was a constant balancing act between celebration and solemnity, between public spectacle and private devotion. This debate reveals that the medieval soundscape was a contested space. The control of sound was a form of power, and the bell ringer, perhaps more than anyone, held that power in his hands. He decided, rope by rope, whether his tower would speak in the language of heavenly harmony or earthly announcement, always aware that for every person who heard music, another might only hear noise. Behind the sacred duty and secret knowledge lay a ledger. The medieval bell ringer was a working professional, and his service came with a clear price tag paid in coin, kind, and privilege. His income was a patchwork carefully stitched together from multiple sources to ensure his reliability. For most, the foundation was a small annual salary from the parish church or the town council. This was rarely enough to live on comfortably, but it established him as a formal employee, a man with a recognized post. The real earnings, however, came from fees. Every time he performed a service outside the rigid schedule of canonical hours, he could expect a payment. Ringing the bells for a wedding brought a tip from the groom's family. A funeral required a fee from the deceased's estate for the tolling, with larger payments for more elaborate peals. If the local lord had a son, or a royal proclamation was to be announced, the town treasury would disburse special funds for the celebratory ringing. These fees were his lifeblood, turning his sacred skill into a viable trade. In many places, payment also came in the form of tangible goods. A bell ringer might be granted the right to a strip of farmland on the church glebe, or receive a regular allotment of bread, ale, and firewood from the parish stores. This system of payment in kind wove him directly into the local economy, making the baker, the brewer, and the farmer his indirect employers. His most valuable compensations, however, were often not coins or loaves but exemptions. To ensure he was always at his post, many towns granted the bell ringer freedom from certain taxes, such as the levy on hearths or windows. More significantly, he was frequently excused from mandatory militia duty. While other men were required to train with the pike on Sundays or stand watch on the walls, the bell ringer's defense of the community was deemed to happen in the tower. His weapon was the alarm bell, and his constant presence was considered more vital than an extra soldier in the ranks. These exemptions were a mark of high status, a recognition that his singular role was indispensable to the town's very functioning. But with great privilege came severe accountability. The penalties for failure were strict and financially painful. A churchwarden's account from a 15th century English parish records a fine of 4 pence, a substantial sum levied against the ringer for failing to sound the curfew bell on time. Missing a toll for a funeral meant forfeiting the fee and often paying an additional fine to the grieving family for the spiritual slight. The gravest failure, however, was sounding a false alarm. To ring the frantic fire or invasion peal without true cause was not just an error, it was an act of social and economic sabotage. It would pull farmers from their fields, halt all work in the town, and potentially cause panic and injury. The punishment for this was severe, ranging from massive fines that could wipe out a year's earnings to public whipping to imprisonment. In extreme cases, a ringer found guilty of a malicious false alarm could be stripped of his position and banished from the community, his trusted voice permanently silenced. This concrete economic framework completes our portrait. He was not a mystical hermit, but a craftsman with a contract. His wages, perks, and penalties tied him to the mundane world of markets and laws, grounding his celestial music in the very earthly realities of bread, taxes, and consequence. Every pull of the rope was thus a calculation balancing spiritual duty, professional pride, and economic survival. The bell ringer's authority was not confined to the parish steeple. His unique skills made him a strategic asset to the most powerful figures of the age, kings and military commanders, who saw the control of sound as a form of control over men and territory. In the great stone keeps of royal castles, a dedicated bell ringer was a standard post. His tower was higher and his bells were larger, often designed to be heard across an entire county. From that vantage, his rings performed a dual function. They enforced the daily schedule of the castle garrison and its supporting town with military precision, but they also served as a continuous broadcast of royal presence. The regular, confident peals were a sonic claim to the land, a reminder to every baron, peasant, and potential rival within earshot that the king's law and the king's time reigned here. This was not just timekeeping, it was acoustic sovereignty. The castle ringer enjoyed a more secure position than his parish counterpart, often receiving a better wage, a uniform, and quarters within the fortress walls. His role placed him firmly within the royal administrative machine, a technician of order in service to the crown. This connection to power became even more direct on the battlefield. During military campaigns, the ability to send clear, instantaneous signals over the roar of combat was priceless. While large bells could not be carried with an army, the principles of their use certainly were. Commanders employed systems of flags, horns, and drums that operated on the same logic as the bell codes, using distinct, memorized patterns to order advances, retreats, or shifts in formation. The bell ringer's deep understanding of rhythmic communication made him an ideal candidate to learn and execute these vital battlefield signals. There are records from sieges that highlight their critical value. When an army laid siege to a town, one of the first strategic objectives was often the capture of the main church tower. It was the highest point, offering an unparalleled view of the defenders' positions. Once secured, the besiegers would not destroy the bells, they would use them. A military ringer or a soldier with the knowledge would ascend the captured tower and ring a specific pre-arranged peal. This sound, audible across the entire battlefield to the attacking forces but meaningless to the defenders below, could coordinate a synchronized assault on a weakened gate or signal a diversionary attack. In this scenario, the sacred instrument of a community became a weapon turned against it, its familiar voice now speaking a foreign, hostile command. For the skilled ringer who entered this world, the rewards could be significant. A master of signals who proved his worth in a successful campaign might attract the patronage of a noble or a general, being taken into their permanent household. This offered a life far removed from the solitary parish tower, one involving travel, better pay, and involvement in the grand affairs of state. It was a path, though rare, that demonstrated the ultimate value of his craft. When kings and generals listened, the bell ringer's language was not one of prayer, but of power, and his hands could shape the outcomes of history as surely as they shaped the swing of a bell. Yet the very power that made them valuable to kings also made them a target. The seismic upheaval of the Protestant Reformation did not just challenge church doctrine, it declared war on the medieval soundscape itself. For reformers like John Calvin in Geneva and Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich, the bell tower was a fortress of superstition. They argued that the consecration of bells, the belief they could ward off storms or scatter demons, was pure pagan magic dressed in Christian robes. The complex peals for saints' days and the tolling for the dead were seen as empty rituals, distracting the faithful from the pure, word-based worship they championed. To them, the bell was not a holy instrument but an idol of bronze. This theological conviction triggered a wave of silent destruction across Protestant regions. In a radical and shocking act, authorities ordered the removal of bells from church towers. Thousands were taken down, their sacred voices stilled forever. Some were simply sold for scrap, melted into mundane cannons or coins. Others were violently destroyed on the spot, smashed with hammers in the churchyard as a public renunciation of the old ways. In less extreme parishes, the bells were left hanging but forbidden to ring, their ropes cut, a permanent and haunting symbol of the new order. For the bell ringer, this was an existential catastrophe. His entire world, his sacred calling, his intricate science, his very livelihood was declared illegal. The guilds, with their secret oaths and methods, were disbanded overnight. A master of grandsire triples now found himself a man without a trade, his years of training rendered not just useless but heretical. This forced a desperate, painful adaptation. Some ringers, stripped of their purpose, faded into other trades, becoming blacksmiths or laborers, their hands that once danced with mathematical precision now gripping simpler tools. Others leveraged their unique skills into new, secular roles. Their deep understanding of timekeeping and signals made them valuable as town watchmen or early clock winders for the new mechanical town clocks that were replacing the celestial rhythms. A few, in regions where the Reformation was less severe, performed a dangerous double life. They might publicly conform to the new Protestant services, but in secret, at the request of traditional families or in remote villages, they would still ring the old patterns for a covert Catholic Mass or a forbidden Saint's Day, their art now an act of silent rebellion. This clandestine ringing added a profound new layer of secrecy to their history. The tower, once a beacon of public truth, became a potential hiding place for forbidden sound. The Reformation, therefore, did more than silence bells. It fractured a 1,000-year-old tradition, scattering its keepers and forcing their sacred science into the shadows, where it would either evolve or wait patiently for a time when the world might once again listen for its coded messages in the air. The bell's voice was not just a shield or a schedule, it was a binding legal instrument. In the intricate web of medieval justice, the sound of a bell could initiate a manhunt, corroborate a timeline, and even bear witness to the truth. This function began with a fundamental legal principle known as the hue and cry. If you were robbed on the road or assaulted in a market, your first duty was not to find a constable, but to make noise loud, immediate, and unmistakable noise. In many towns, the quickest way to do this was to rush to the nearest church and seize the bell rope, or to ring a dedicated alarm bell in the square. That frantic, urgent peal was more than a call for help, it was a legal summons. By ancient custom, every able-bodied man who heard the hue and cry was legally obligated to drop what he was doing, grab any weapon at hand, and join the pursuit of the criminal. To ignore the call was itself a punishable offense. The bell transformed a private victim into a public prosecutor, mobilizing the entire community as a posse in moments. In this system, the bell ringer was often the catalyst, his trained hands giving the victim's alarm its most effective and far-reaching voice. Once the chase was over and the suspect was in the dock, the bell ringer's role shifted from mobilizer to expert witness. His testimony carried unique weight because his entire life was governed by precise public timekeeping. A court might need to establish exactly when a theft occurred or where a defendant claimed to be at a specific hour. The bell ringer could be summoned and sworn in. He would then testify under oath about the exact pattern he rang and the time he rang it. His word was trusted because his schedule was the town's schedule. If he stated he rang the curfew bell at the usual time, and a witness claimed to have seen the accused abroad after that sound, it could form a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence. His professional routine became a forensic clock, his memory of his own actions providing a fixed point in a world before reliable timepieces. This made him an auxiliary limb of the law, a human chronometer whose daily function could lock or break an alibi. The most profound legal role, however, was reserved for the bell itself. In certain solemn proceedings, the bell was not just a tool but a participant. When oaths were sworn on matters of great importance, a boundary dispute between lords, a treaty between merchants, or a vow of innocence, the ceremony might be held within the bell tower or in the church porch. The bell would be rung before, during, or after the oath was spoken. The belief was that the consecrated voice of the bronze sanctified the promise, calling God and the saints to bear witness. To break an oath sworn under the bell was considered a double sin, a betrayal of both man and the divine witness invoked by the sound. In a sense, the bell became a character in the legal drama, its resonant note serving as the audible seal on a contract or a plea. This intertwining of sacred sound and secular law completes a remarkable picture. The medieval bell ringer was at various times a human alarm system, a forensic timekeeper, and a facilitator of sacred oaths. His tower was not separate from the courthouse, it was an extension of it, proving that in a world ordered by sound, justice itself required a voice that could reach every ear and touch every soul. Their silent testimony is not just in the sound they made, but in the marks they left behind. High in the bell chamber, cast into the very bronze, we find the most formal of these legacies. Inscriptions circle the shoulders of great bells, often in Latin, declaring their sacred purpose. A typical inscription might read, "I am called the bell of Saint Mary. I summon the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning." These were not just labels, they were statements of identity and power, a permanent echo of the baptism ceremony that gave the bell its holy name. Often, the names of the donors who paid for the bell are also cast there, alongside the founder who forged it, ensuring their memory would ring out for centuries. These words are public and proud, meant to be seen by the rare visitor who ascended to the chamber. But for a more intimate human connection, you must look away from the bronze and toward the stone. In the ringing chamber below, on the soft limestone or sandstone walls surrounding the rope holes, a different history is written by hand. Here, generations of bell ringers left their personal graffiti. Using a pocket knife or a sharp nail, they carved their initials and a date. You might find J.R. 1582 or W.T. his mark 1665 nestled among 100 others. These are not acts of vandalism, but acts of presence. In an age before photographs or employee records, this was how a man said, "I was here, this was my post." The carvings are often clustered near where a particular ringer would stand for his bell, a territorial claim on a patch of stone. Among the names and dates, you find fragments of their world. A simple, carefully drawn sailing ship might appear, carved by a ringer dreaming of the sea he could see from the tower window. A crude sundial or a heraldic shield shows a moment of idle decoration. But the most fascinating marks of all are those that reveal the intellectual heart of their craft. On some walls, you can find practice diagrams for change ringing. These are geometric patterns, grids of dots and lines, sometimes with numbers beside them. They are the physical evidence of a ringer working out a complex method, tracing the path of his bell through the mathematical dance on the stone before committing it to memory. This graffiti is a silent conversation across time. One ringer carves his initials, and a century later, another adds his own beside it, a fellowship of the rope spanning generations. These marks tell of boredom and devotion, of a young apprentice idly scratching his name, and of a master working through a problem in his art. They are the mundane counterpoint to the glorious sound, the quiet human scratch beside the majestic bronze voice. In these simple carvings, the secret life becomes visible, a tangible whisper from the men who lived in the tower, reminding us that behind every peal that shook the air, there was a person with a knife, a thought, and a need to say, "I was here." Those carved initials on the stone are a testament to endurance. The tradition of change ringing, nearly silenced by the Reformation, did not die. Instead, it retreated, adapted, and found a new heart in England. There, in parish towers across the countryside, the secretive guilds of old slowly transformed into the bell-ringing societies we know today. These are not shadowy brotherhoods, but open associations of dedicated volunteers, yet they perform the same mathematical miracles with the same ropes. The methods with names like Plain Bob and Grandsire, those intricate blueprints developed in the 16th and 17th centuries, are not historical relics in a museum. They are the active repertoire of every practicing bell ringer. When a team gathers in a tower today, they are quite literally pulling the same sequences, thinking the same patterns, and creating the same cascading permutations that their counterparts did 400 years ago. It is a living algorithm passed down through an unbroken chain of hands and memories. This continuity is astonishing. In an age of digital noise, the voice of the medieval tower still speaks, not as a recording, but as a real-time performance of ancient intellect. The modern ringer, however, experiences this heritage in a profoundly different context. Gone is the life of solitary obligation, the constant threat of plague or invaders, the reliance on the bells for daily survival. For today's hobbyist, ringing is a choice, a passionate puzzle pursued for the joy of mental and physical coordination. They arrive at the tower by car, not by a lifetime bond to a parish. They ring for the challenge of a perfect peal, not to warn a town of fire or to scatter demons from a thundercloud. The immense social power and spiritual responsibility have largely faded, replaced by camaraderie and the satisfaction of preserving a rare art. What has been lost is the visceral connection between the sound and the survival of a community. The bell is no longer the town's nervous system, but what has been preserved against all odds is the craft itself. The precise feel of the rope, the mental architecture of the methods, the collective breath held as 8 bells weave their non-repeating path through thousands of changes. These sensations are a direct line back to the ringing chamber of the past. That a person today can step into a tower and perform the same actions with the same intent as a medieval professional is a quiet miracle of dedication. It means the secret life was not entirely secret after all. It was kept alive not in locked manuscripts but in practiced hands, ensuring that the coded language of bronze continues to echo, now by choice, into our modern world. The bell ringer emerges from the shadows of history not as a simple laborer but as a figure of remarkable complexity. He was a mathematician conducting living algorithms in the air with ropes and bronze. He was a master communicator, speaking a fluent, coded language that could announce a birth, mourn a death, or mobilize an army. He stood as a spiritual warrior, believing the baptized voice of his bells could shatter storms and hold back the dark. His hands were the town's clock, carving the raw flow of time into disciplined blocks of work, prayer, and rest. And he was a sworn member of a secretive brotherhood, guarding ancient methods and sharing a bond forged in physical risk and intellectual pride. His was a life of immense, unseen responsibility, where hidden knowledge met profound connection to the very heartbeat of his community. The rhythmic world of the Middle Ages did not simply happen, it was actively maintained day and night by the person in the tower. When we think of that era now, the sound that most often echoes in our cultural memory is the sound he produced, the call to mass, the warning peal, the mournful toll. That is his lasting imprint, so the next time you hear the deep, resonant voice of a church bell carried on the wind, listen more closely. You are not just hearing a note. You are hearing the legacy of the keeper of time, the weaver of patterns, the guardian of the silent hours. You are hearing the echo of a secret life. What stories do the bells in your own town or city hold? Share any local legends or your own reflections on this hidden history in the comments below.